I want to talk about Deuteronomy 22, verses 23 to 27. And I want to explain some of the key ways that this passage is very, very problematic from an ethical and legal perspective through a contemporary lens, and ultimately why that matters. So, first of all, let's start reading the passage, starting in verse 23. If a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married and sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The young woman, because she was in town and did not scream for help, and the man, because he violated another man's wife. You must purge the evil from among you. But in the country, a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her. Only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the woman. She has committed no sin deserving death. This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbor. For the man found the young woman out in the country, and though the betrothed woman screamed, there was no one to rescue her. Okay, the first problem here is that adultery, in the first case, is being addressed, what is professedly, allegedly adultery, is being addressed through stoning, a practice in which typically one's buried up to their waist and then pelted to death with rocks, people throwing rocks randomly at their head, their face, their torso, their arms, and so on. To be stoned to death with rocks can take an hour or more potentially to die. People are often they're blocking themselves like this. It is an extraordinarily violent, bloody, and cruel way to execute somebody. So we have two things here. First of all, the ethics of whether it is appropriate to kill people if they commit adultery, and then the second issue of the mode of killing, whether stoning people to death, pelting them to death with rocks, is cruel and unusual as a form of execution, or whether it is morally illicit. And I think on both counts, I would have problems. I would object to killing people for committing adultery and also to pelting them to death with rocks as the mode of killing them for committing adultery. Having said that, that's not my interest here, my primary interest in talking about this passage. Rather, I want to compare that there are these two different scenarios that are being addressed and how there is an enormous underlying problem with the overall framework by which they are addressed. So in the first scenario, a man has sexual intercourse with a woman. In the second as well. In both scenarios, they're also betrothed. The women are betrothed to another man, essentially married to another man, promised to another man. So they're unavailable in that sense. But there's a difference. That's the similarities. There's two key differences in both of these scenarios. In the first scenario, this sexual contact, this sexual interaction occurs within a city, quote unquote. So a settled region where there are other people in the vicinity. And the second, it occurs in the country where there are likely no people around. And the second difference is in the first scenario, the woman does not cry out or call out during the act. In the second scenario, she does. And based upon the differences, city versus country, calling out versus not calling out, in the first, it is considered adultery, and the woman is pelted to death with rocks along with the man. In the second, it's not considered adultery, but rather rape. What is going on here? What is the logic between these two different assessments? Well, it's this. So again, in the second passage in the countryside, it says, this case is like someone who attacks and murders a neighbor. For the man found the young woman out in the country, and though the betrothed woman screamed, there was no one to rescue her. So in the second scenario, the woman calls out for help, but does not get it because there's no one around. And that vindicates her. It shows that she was not a willing participant consenting to the act because she called out for help. And she could not get it because there was no one else, but the very calling out redeems her, in a sense, from the act of adultery. I mean, that's fair enough. I agree with that. But then we turn to the city. So in the city region, we read the woman was in a town and did not scream for help. So really, I think there's two things going on here. First of all, is there's an expectation that if you are not consenting, you will scream for help, particularly if people can hear you. They can't hear you in the country. So maybe the woman in the country, hypothesizing here, it doesn't directly address this, but maybe the woman in the country would not be as culpable for not screaming for help because there would be no one around practically to hear her. But if you're in the city and you don't scream for help, that's in a sense a double whammy. By not screaming for help, you are implicitly consenting to the act, if not explicitly, and all the more so when there were people in the vicinity that could have heard you and could have helped you. And that's what I want to focus on. So here's the problem with this. The whole logic then of this passage assumes that a young woman who has sexual intercourse with a man in a region, area where other people may potentially hear her, if she doesn't call out for help, it follows that she has consented to the act, and thus that the act should be categorized as, in this case, adultery, rather than as sexual assault or rape. The problem with that is this, that people respond to trauma in different ways. One of the ways they respond to trauma, including the trauma of experiencing sexual assault or rape, is by going into a freeze response, which is called tonic immobility. When you become tonically immobile, you become compliant, you do whatever the other person says, you do not object. You may even go into a more extreme case of collapsed immobility, where you become paralyzed, where you may even pass out, you may have no memory. All of that involves a trauma response that is redirecting energy to survive the trauma of the incident. And what this means is, what this entails is that just because a woman does not cry out for help, even if there's a person in the next house or the next room, doesn't of itself entail that they were consenting to the act. They could very well have been raped and had a trauma tonic immobility response or a collapsed immobility response. They've dissociated from the act, and this is how they survived the trauma of being sexually assaulted. Uh, the problem then is this, that Deuteronomy 22, 23, and 24 appeals to grounds to kill a woman by pelting her to death with rocks, which includes people who have responded to sexual assault through the trauma of tonic immobility. In other words, people who have been raped are then directed by this passage to be executed after their rape. Now, of course, that doesn't mean every woman who has failed to call out was not consenting. Some may consent. But the point is this, that this text, this directive, this legal framework does not distinguish between those who did consent and those who, in fact, were sexually assaulted and raped and had a tonic immobility response. It says for all of them, pelt them to death with rocks. So the double problem here then is not only the ethics with, well, dealing with sexual infidelity by killing people. Second, dealing with the killing by way of pelting them to death with rocks. But then third, what we've just been talking about, is failing to distinguish between those who actually did consent versus those who had a tonic immobility response and killing them all indiscriminately. The problem then is this, how for Christians to say, well, this is the perfect law of God, this creates enormous problems because presumably a perfect law is going to distinguish very carefully, meticulously between those who were raped versus those who did freely consent to the act. And a passage that doesn't do that, this raises significant, serious objections to that being the perfect law of God in the way often conceived by Christians. Now, this opens up, of course, other possibilities, such as viewing Deuteronomy 22 as an imperfect law, representing the fallible and limited moral, ethical, legal horizons and psychological horizons of understanding of people in the ancient Near East. And I think that makes much more sense of this passage. But it does require Christians then to adopt a more critical lens when they're looking at passages such as in the Torah and think, how do I appropriate and understand and interpret and apply these passages rather than just saying this represents a perfect law to govern a morally just and righteous society.